I'd always planned on watching the 2022 Secret Garden. I never got round to it. Finally, I have. And I have to say it's pretty good. There are two ways of looking at this. One, as somebody who's perhaps never seen The Secret Garden, is it a good introduction to the story? Are they going to enjoy it? And two, if you grew up with an earlier version, for example, I was a big fan of the 1993 version. I watched it a lot. How does it compare? Is it worth watching if you're a fan of that version? And the answer to both of those questions is, I would say it's worth watching on both counts. This is directed by Marc, Munden, written by Jack Thorne, based of course on the novel by Frances Hodgson Burnett, and it stars Dixie Egerickx as our protagonist Mary Lennox. We also have Julie Walters as Mrs. Medlock, and Colin Firth as Mr. Craven, and Edan Hayhurst as Colin. And very briefly, if you're unaware of what the story is about, I don't want to go into too much detail. I don't want to give too much away about this because it is such a fascinating story. Mary Lennox was brought up in India, but her parents are no longer around, so she's sent back to England to live with her uncle. And things are quite strict in the household. It's a large house, not a lot of people for Mary to interact with, and she discovers, of course, the secret garden. And the garden is rather beautiful. I don't want to constantly compare this film to the 1993 version because that's not fair, but what I will say is the garden in the 1993 version felt a lot more enclosed. It felt like when we were in the garden in that film, it felt like the rest of the world didn't exist, like we were enclosed in this garden, whereas the garden in this one seems quite vast, but very open, and I get the sense of the world outside of it. So I prefer the garden in the first film, but beyond that, I'm not really going to do any comparison. I think Mary is a brilliant character, very well-written protagonist, really great performance here. Really enjoyed her journey in this film. I think Colin is a really likeable character as well, and their interactions together I'm particularly fond of. And the house is stunning. It is absolutely beautiful, both the interiors and exteriors. The exterior for the house is actually Harloxton Manor in Grantham. This film was filmed in a lot of different places. It was filmed in Wales, North Yorkshire, Cornwall, Grantham, and the garden itself was filmed in a lot of places, which might actually contribute to the fact that it doesn't necessarily feel like we're enclosed in this same space. It feels almost too vast for my liking, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. Had I not seen the previous version, I think the 1993 was the previous version. I don't think there's been a version in between, but had I not seen that one, I probably wouldn't have had that thought. So no real complaints, but just something that's worth bearing in mind. If you've seen the 93 version, then the garden might not be as pleasing here. But nevertheless, the film is very good. The narrative is really emotional. There are a lot of emotions right at the surface of this film, and there are some really beautiful moments, some really moving scenes, and the performances are really great. Of course, we have great casting, and generally very well filmed. No complaints at all. I did enjoy it, and I do think that it's a pretty solid film. If you're new to The Secret Garden, I'd say absolutely check it out. It's a good way to enjoy the story. But that being said, I do think the 1993 version is better. Slightly biased because I grew up with it, very big fan of it, but at the same time, I just think the garden is much better in that film. I enjoyed spending time in that garden significantly more than I did in this film. But nevertheless, if this appeals to you, maybe there's somebody in the cast you want to see, maybe you just want to check this one out because you have easier access to it, whatever reason, I think that it's worth watching. If you're a fan of The Secret Garden in general, then it's definitely worth checking out. The 2022 version might not be my favourite version, but it's still pretty great, and I'm very happy to recommend it.